Folks in the back, is the volume okay? Thank you. All right. Let me remind you to be sure and come to class on Monday because we are returning your graded blue books. Now, you can still get your graded blue book if you don't come on Monday, but if you're eager to get your test and read the comments, come on Monday. And you know what to do if you're surprised or disappointed with the grade. I've gone over that several times, okay? All right. Today I'm talking about slavery, and I'll be talking about slavery in several subsequent lectures. I'll be talking about slavery in terms of the slaves themselves. I'll be talking about slavery in terms of national and regional politics. I'll be talking about slavery in terms of culture, all through the colonies and the United States. In fact, it's very difficult to understand almost anything about U.S. colonial history or subsequent history without understanding slavery. Slavery is lurking behind almost anything you're going to study in American history, and sometimes it's right there at the center. So, we have to understand something about when and how and why slavery began, how it became institutionalized, how it changed over time, the ideology behind slavery. Because we certainly can't understand the Southern colonies or the 19th century South without slavery. In fact, it's very difficult to understand completely the Northern colonies and certainly racism among white Northerners in the 18th century or in the 19th century without understanding slavery. And we really can't understand aspects of the American Revolution without understanding the morbid fear of political slavery that was such a part of the revolutionary rhetoric. And we certainly can't understand the complexity, the political and economic complexity of how the United States expanded territorially. How that happened, when that happened, the discussion about how it happened. We can't understand any of that unless we understand slavery. And we certainly can't understand the first half of the 19th century, neither culturally or politically, without understanding something about slavery, quite a bit about slavery. Because by then, there was an interstate slave trade, the African American family, and a distinct African American slave culture was well developed. There had been several slave revolts. And there was the abolition movement, the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party. None of this makes sense unless we understand slavery and how people felt about it. So some of the most significant episodes of the political history of the nation really don't make any sense without an understanding of slavery, and certainly even contemporary racism or America's style of racism. We can't understand without the history of slavery. The contrast between the development of colonies and then states in the North and the South in terms of public education, cities, manufacturing, and other social institutions, we can't really understand that without reference to slavery. We can't begin I would claim, to understand even the simplest aspects of American history without acknowledging the monumental significance of 300 to 350 years of slavery in the colonies in the United States. So, let's start with this simple fact. Approximately 11 million Africans were imported to the Americas, North and South America, during the 4 centuries of the international slave trade. 76% of those 11 million, in other words, the overwhelming majority of that 11 million, arrived in the Americas between 1701 and 1810. In 11 years. Half of these went to the Caribbean, a third went to the Portuguese colonies in South America, 10% went to Spanish America, and 600,000 of the Africans taken from the Gold Coast of Africa were brought to the British mainland colonies of North America. But when we talk about, and that's what the map demonstrates. And then of course, you've read in Foner about what we call the Middle Passage. And that was the slaves' passage on the slave trading ships across the Atlantic Ocean. And you've seen the dreadful drawings about how the slaves, as cargo, ought to be arranged in the ships so that you could get as many slaves as possible in one ship for one crossing. You see some of that in the top right. And then, of course, slaves were treated as prisoners, as you notice in the drawing of the bottom right. Well, we have to start in the 17th century. And an historian who has written The Black South, I may be getting the title wrong, named John Bowles, calls the 17th century the tentative beginnings of slavery in North America. Africans were the first Africans to set foot in North America were on Dutch slave trading ships, and the Dutch needed some provisions, and you can't buy them at sea. And so they docked and they traded a couple of slaves for some of the provisions that they needed. This was in Virginia colony. Now, at that time, slaves cost twice as much as indentured servants, but they had the same short life expectancy. So it made no economic sense for planters, people that needed extra labor. It made no economic sense to purchase slaves. Plus, to tell you the truth, the English and the Europeans that were settling the colonies of mainland North America preferred white indentured servants to slaves. They preferred to be around white indentured servants. I mean, they were English. They knew how to deal with them. They knew the terms of the indenture. They knew what that meant. It wasn't until the late 18th century that most Africans who worked in the tobacco fields, for example, were slaves instead of servants, because even some of the first Africans that came to the North American colonies were first considered indentured servants. As long as the supply of European servants continued to be undiminished, the American colonists saw no reason to make any changes. Not only because of the expense, but Africans didn't speak English, not initially. They had to be trained and acclimated to a different culture. to a new environment. And it wasn't just that slaves were more expensive than an indentured servant, but with an indentured servant, if you agreed to bring an indentured servant to the colonies, you got 50 acres of land. On one occasion, a man in a Virginia colony named George Carter imported 80 indentured servants to his Virginia plantation, and for that he was given 4,000 acres. He was going to be raising quite a bit of tobacco and becoming very, very rich. No land came with the purchase of African slaves. It was only in the 18th century, after the number of indentured servants from England began to be significantly reduced, that African slaves became the preferred labor force in America. So, according to Ellis, the book that you're reading, and other historians, before the American Revolution, there were 4 areas of the colonies with distinctive patterns in terms of slavery. The tentative beginnings of slavery in the Chesapeake. Slaves were used to help grow tobacco, which was commercial agriculture for export, as you know. The Carolinas had an early commitment to slavery. West Indian whites were used to slavery, and many of the first Carolinians came from the West Indies. They were growing rice and indigo for export, commercial crops. Louisiana, growing sugar, rice, commercially for export. And then there are the northern colonies. Slavery was widespread in the colonies, but the population of Africans, and then later African Americans, in the North was much, much, much smaller because the economies were different. You understand that. Okay. The bottom drawing is particularly interesting because that is, the tobacco has been harvested and the slaves are getting it ready for curing, or that they may be in the process of curing it. And then on the top right, that's a sugarcane plantation, probably in Louisiana. Okay, so speaking of the supply of indentured servants drying up, well, that was the main thing. By the end of the 17th century, the economy was improving in England. There were fewer unemployed people who were willing to become indentured servants. And that was true not only in England, but in Germany and France, a source for a few indentured servants that were brought to the colonies. And then, also in the late 1600s, the late 17th century, because westward expansion, or expansion of the Anglo frontier into new land of the West, that had slowed down considerably. And so, when an indentured slave finished his or her indenture, they were no longer given land as the indentured servants of the early 1600s. So, that meant that you had landless people, and if you're living in the South and you don't have land, you have no way to make a living. And so they became troublesome. I point you to Bacon's Rebellion. So, it was late in the 17th century that the Royal African Company, an English Joint Stock Company, began direct shipments from West Africa to mainland North America. And the workforce of indentured servants was gradually replaced by a workforce of African slaves. In 1700, the number of African slaves in the mainland colonies of North America probably surpassed the number of indentured servants in the Chesapeake Bay Area colonies. And it had always been more than in South Carolina. As slave labor increased, colonists wrote slavery into the law. 1662, Virginia law that specified children inherited their slave status from their mothers. If their mother was a slave, the child was a slave. You can't be sure about the father, so that's why the rule has to do, the law has to do with the mother. In 1667, being baptized as a Christian was no longer affected the eventual probability of freedom. For a few years, Africans who converted and who were baptized as Christians could expect to be freed before too long. They wouldn't die slaves. But that was changed in 1667. In 1669, slave death by a master was declared not a felony. It was a crime, but it wasn't a felony. In 1705, Virginia's slave codes, statutes, combined and extended in the Virginia Slave Code, became a model for other colonies. Now, let's see. Slavery was legal everywhere. Slavery was legal in all of the colonies. And don't try to memorize these numbers or even write them down, but note the growth of the slave population and why, in a few minutes when I'm talking about the 18th century, John Bowles refers to the 18th century as the crucial 18th century, because look how dramatically the African and then African American population grows. But then look at all the little boxes attached to the various states and notice that slavery was everywhere. Notice which states had significant slave populations and which states had very small slave populations. Now, in the North, farms were smaller, and a farmer might own a slave, maybe two, if he was in the dairying business. But he didn't need, and so he didn't need a lot of hired help or bonded help. So the slave population was always smaller. Also, in the North, slaves were used for a lot of things, especially in building. There are a number of major institutions in the northern states that were built by slave labor, like Columbia University, the buildings at Columbia University. Now, in the South, slaves worked in areas other than agriculture. You'll get an example of this when you read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Slaves worked with some tradesmen. Slaves worked in the Southern economy, of course, was not very diversified, not nearly as diversified as the Northern economy, but they were employed or they were used for tasks other than the manual labor needed for farms. The slave trade in the North American mainland increased significantly. between 1700 and 1770, the crucial 18th century. 80,000 slaves were imported to the Chesapeake colonies. Yes. Before the international slave trade ended, you know the year? 1808. That was in the Constitution. It could not end before 1808, and you can be sure that legislation was passed to require its end in 1808. Well, before 1808, 100,000 Africans had arrived in the Charleston port. One of every 5 ancestors of today's African American population was probably a slave. Now, Joseph Ellis's very important chapter entitled The Silence. Be sure and read the questions in the study guide, and be sure and know what that chapter title refers to. I'm going to identify a few points in that chapter. I don't need to go through it carefully because you're reading it. But one of the first things I want to point out is that anti-slavery societies existed before the Revolution. You are well aware of the increase in anti-slavery during the American Revolution. You are well aware that there was a lot of agitation during the period of resistance and the Revolutionary era. We've got to end slavery. While we are doing this revolutionary thing, we need to end slavery. But that didn't happen. But please note, even before there was that egalitarian rhetoric that the Patriots were spouting against the British, and that rhetoric in the Declaration of Independence, even before all of that, even before the resistance movement, before the Stamp Act, before all of that, please note that there were anti-slavery colonies that existed in anti-slavery organizations that existed in most of the colonies. Now, they were small. They weren't particularly active. They weren't active in the way that 19th century abolitionists were active. But what I'm pointing out is that sentiments opposed to slavery, or people who we would later call Americans who opposed slavery, didn't suddenly emerge during the American Revolutionary era. There were colonists in every colony who, from the beginning, opposed slavery. Quakers, to be sure, opposed slavery. And one of the leaders in the anti-slavery movement, one who wrote quite eloquently in opposition to slavery, was a Quaker named John Woolman. He lived in England, but Quakers in the colonies read his works. So certainly in communities where there was a large number of Quakers, there were anti-slavery societies. But I think it's really important that you understand this. The idea that there was something wrong with slavery, that we ought not to do that it's not fair, that it's not humane, that it's immoral, that idea existed long before this Enlightenment egalitarian rhetoric. Some people didn't need to be told, this is not okay. As one man said, the Declaration of Independence, the secular version of American scripture. Oh no, this is from Ellis, page 89. was an unambiguous tract for abolition. But we know that these 18th century gentlemen did not really think that all people were created equal. They didn't even think that all white people were created equal. Rather, the Declaration asserts the equality of the colonists with Englishmen in England. And so vis-a-vis government, the colonists should be considered equal to Englishmen who live in England. That is the equality of which they spoke. And then in the Constitutional Congress meeting of 1776, there was a repeal of the 1774 non-importation agreement. In fact, all the non-importation agreements were repealed except the slave trade. Military manpower, as by necessity, increased emancipation schemes during the war. As you know, the British made it well known in the colonies as they were pursuing the revolution. Slaves, if you will come and fight with us against your masters, against this independence movement, when the war is over and we have won the war, you will be freed. Well, that's a pretty good offer. Slaves were also used, in some respects, in the Continental Army. But what's most noticeable is the post-war emancipation movements. And they were mostly in the North because the northern colonies that were now states were not as dependent, not as economically dependent upon slavery as the southern colonies now states. So, when Vermont and New Hampshire rewrote their state constitutions, there was no slavery. A Massachusetts State Supreme Court decision was handed down in 1783 that ruled slavery unconstitutional, as according to the Massachusetts State Constitution. And then Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut passed laws abolishing or providing for the gradual manumission of slaves in 1780, 1784, respectively. Even in Virginia, in 1782, a law was passed that allowed manumission, that allowed owners to free their slaves if they so desired. Now, if you read Thomas Jefferson's plan, in Notes on the State of Virginia, there is a program, a plan, for eventual gradual emancipation. He made a point that it could not be anything but gradual, because the slaves would be so angry and resentful of their owners, and by extension, all whites, that the two couldn't possibly coexist. Which tells you that Thomas Jefferson realized that life as a slave was sometimes quite harsh and sometimes quite cruel. If he didn't know that, why would he imagine that whites would be murdered in their sleep if slaves were immediately emancipated? And of course, he believed that because African Americans who had been slaves would be so resentful of white society. He believed that slaves needed to go live somewhere else. Thomas Jefferson even proposed to Congress that it prohibit slavery in all of the Western territories. All of the Western territories. And that failed by only one vote. But despite the rhetoric and the ideology of liberty, the primary goal of the revolution was political regarding the removal of the British Empire from the North American mainland. And, as I've said so many times, protection of property rights was considered an indispensable component of liberty. And also, by 1776, 1787, slavery was already woven into the fabric of American society. Especially in the South, where there was so much commercial agriculture and many, many more slaves. Well, I've talked to you about slavery in the Constitution, and I've referred to the debates about slavery at the Constitutional Convention. Early on in the Constitutional Convention, someone mentioned that, well, if we're going to make some changes to the Articles of Confederation, if we're going to write a new constitution, we can make some big changes. Like we can, I'm sure we would agree to abolish slavery. Oh no. Oh no, 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 no. Now, remember, the Constitutional Convention is 1787. A number of northern states have passed laws providing for the eventual, if not the immediate, abolition of slavery. And so someone suggests at the Constitutional Convention, you know, let's just go all the way. Someone, I don't know this for a fact, but someone may have even suggested that there would be some way to compensate slave owners for their loss. Slaves as property had a price on their head. They could be sold. They had been sold. They could be resold. But very early in the Constitutional Convention, the delegates from the southern states said they weren't going to cooperate unless there was a compromise on slavery. In fact, some even said, we're seceding from this new nation. These secession threats began in 1787. The implication proved not strong enough to end an institution that was so profitable to white Southern landowners. The implication that, all the revolutionary rhetoric and the Declaration of Independence indicated that slavery did not belong in this republic. But the institution of slavery was, in fact, extremely profitable to Southern landowners. And nobody knew this at the time, but this is before Southerners were growing cotton. Now, tobacco and rice and indigo and sugarcane. Those were commercial crops. People made money off of growing and exporting sugarcane, tobacco, indigo, and rice. You betcha. But this is before Southerners began growing cotton. Oh my gosh. With the Industrial Revolution in England and the backbone of the Industrial Revolution in England and then later in the United States was textile mills. In Europe, the first factories were textile mills. And so the market for cotton was almost insatiable. The price of slaves increased dramatically. This is in the 1800s. Nobody knew that was going to happen at this time, and still, the delegates from the southern states said, we can't be here unless there's a compromise on slavery. And so there was the sectional compromise. No end to the international slave trade for at least 20 years. That would be 1808. The 3/5 rule. Slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of determining representation in Congress. Think about the advantage this was to southern states in terms of the number of congressional representatives from southern states. On the other hand, presumably, if Southerners were going to continue in commercial agriculture, even if their workers were not slaves, they would be somebody. And why should not they be counted at least as 3/5 of a person? And then, as you know, there was the Fugitive Slave Clause. The Fugitive Slave Clause, did you look it up and read it? It compels anyone who is aware, who knows of, who sees a runaway slave, that person is compelled to return that slave to his or her owner. That's in the Constitution, although it uses the word servant. It doesn't say slave. The word slave is not in the Constitution, which is interesting. But everybody knew that was the Fugitive Slave Clause. This was the sectional compromise. This is what William Lloyd Garrison, the radical abolitionist of the 19th century, or this is why, rather, he referred to the U.S. Constitution. He's an American. This sectional compromise and the 3/5 rule, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and no end to the international slave trade until 1808. This is why he referred to the U.S. Constitution as a compact with the devil. That's why he was called a radical abolitionist. It's one reason. Now, about the petitions. Ellis is pretty straightforward on this. In 1790, there was a petition from an anti-slavery Quaker group in Pennsylvania to immediately end the international slave trade. Not to wait, but to immediately. And because, you know, the Constitution said it can't be ended before 1808. This petition is, let's change the Constitution so that we can end it before 1808, so that we can end it now. And the next day, that was a Quaker anti-slavery society, or Quaker petition. The next day, the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, submitted a petition to abolish slavery. Well, there were 3 different reactions. Now, these petitions were submitted to the brand new United States Congress, the United States Congress under the new Constitution. And the 3 reactions were what James Madison called the Virginia straddle. Rather, Virginia's reaction is what James Madison called the Virginia straddle. It was a moderate response. It agreed, the Virginian reaction agreed that slavery was repulsive, but ending slavery was politically impractical, just couldn't do it. And furthermore, discussions about slavery needed to end because every time these discussions came up, this created such agitation. Another reaction to these petitions was, quite predictably, some people pointed out, yes, in the spirit of our revolution, in the spirit of the Declaration of 1776, that was a promissory note for the nation to end slavery. And yet another reaction that was articulated in response to these 2 petitions was to refer to the Constitutional Convention and parts of the Constitutional Convention as a gentleman's agreement that slavery would not be ended. And if those wise gentlemen who wrote the Constitution in 1787 agreed with each other that slavery would not be ended, who are we? We're just congressmen. They wrote the Constitution. Who are we to second guess them and accept, approve, forward these petitions? But they didn't immediately go away. They were referred to a House committee to discuss. And the House committee report on these petitions was issued in March of 1790. The response of James Jackson of Georgia and William Smith of South Carolina wrote this, and it's been said that it's the fullest exposition of the pro-slavery position yet presented in the United States. In fact, virtually every argument that Southern defenders of slavery would mount during the next 70 years. Obviously, these aren't the words of James Jackson. This is Ellis's comment on Jackson and Smith's response. In fact, virtually every argument that Southern defenders of slavery would mount during the next 70 years of the national controversy, right up to the eve of the Civil War, came gushing forth over the next 2 days. And those arguments were: slave owners had an agreement in 1787. The Constitution's been ratified. We can't go back on that now. A second argument was, slavery's not our fault. What? Slave owners had an agreement in 1787 when the Constitution was written. And then the second one, slavery's not our fault. Another, it's just not practical. Practicality must take precedence over ideology. In other words, pro-slavery folks said, in other words, and continued to say, slavery is a necessary evil. No one knew it at the time in 1790, but by 1830, pro-slavery Southerners would be saying, they wouldn't be saying it was a necessary evil. They would be saying slavery is a positive good. These people, these Africans, they couldn't live on their own. We take care of them. This is good for them. And then finally, there would be the reference to Thomas Jefferson's racial views and the problems that would ensue with emancipation. Those were the arguments for the continuation of slavery that Jackson and Smith made as representatives of the House Committee in 1790, and those are the arguments that would be made again and again and again and again. There's a congressional debate when the committee releases its report in March 1790. And the result of this debate was that there would be no anti-slavery argument, no pro-emancipation argument from the North, because slavery was unjust, but change was unthinkable. Because of the secessionist threats that had already come from South Carolina and Georgia. And according to Ellis, what the debate revealed was that Congress was very concerned about the future, but their arguments were rooted, deeply rooted in the past. And the core of the disagreement were different versions of America's original intention. And one version was what the Revolution meant for slavery, and another version was what the Revolution meant for slavery. And then there's the Constitution, two founding moments. And as you'll notice, that is a theme of his throughout his text. Okay, I'll see you on Monday.
Wondering, at the start of the lecture, you were talking about how the indentured servants, if they brought them there from England,